September 22nd, 1938. A hurricane of unprecedented speed and ferocity has laid waste to more than 1,000 miles of shoreline, from Long Island to Maine.
It's like a world turned upside down. Railroad tracks that are just sort of spiraling into nothingness. Sailboats washed up on land. Cars bobbing in water. Neighborhoods that have just become splinters.
The storm destroyed 20,000 buildings and damaged 75,000 more. Only 5% of the population has insurance to cover the damage. The morning after the hurricane, Katharine Hepburn and her family returned to the ruins of their summer home in Fenwick, Connecticut.
There was just rubble and just debris everywhere. I mean, not even a sense beyond that a house once stood there.
Always the actress, Hepburn poses for this photo in a bathtub.
Katharine Hepburn was very much on with the show. Fine, you know, we've lost the house, we've got our lives, we've got our health, and fortunately we can rebuild the house.
The people of Jamestown, Rhode Island face tragic news. Of the 8 children who were on board the town school bus the day before, 7 are dead. Only bus driver Norm Caswell and 11-year-old Clayton Chellis survived the hurricane.
Clayton had been a strong swimmer, and he knew from swimming here at Beavertail that the best thing to do was not fight the water, but to swim with it, which is what he did.
That morning, nearly everyone in town gathers around the empty bus, still partially submerged in muddy water.
Because the island was so small and everyone knew everyone else, when people discovered that 7 children had died the day before, it was devastating, not just for the families, but for everybody on the island.
As days pass, one by one, the bodies of the tiny victims wash up on Jamestown's shore. It is a scene repeated throughout New England. 682 people have been killed. High schools become makeshift morgues, while undertakers struggle with shortages of embalming fluid and caskets.
There was a journalist who said one of the enduring memories was the smell of dead bodies. He almost felt like he could taste it in his food.
There were often triple funerals, and that was particularly the case with families. A mother would be buried with her small children if they had all drowned.
In the storm's wake, tough questions are leveled at the D.C. Weather Bureau. Those in the hurricane's path want to know why they weren't warned.
The Weather Bureau said, well, we did announce gale warnings. Gale warnings were discounted. Fishermen were accustomed to gale warnings. They thought that was just a big blow. You know, tie up your boats and close the boathouse. They didn't think that gale warning meant what was going to happen.
If the winds are out of the south in Washington, they must be...
Just 2 hours before the hurricane struck, forecaster Charles Pierce had accurately predicted its intensity and its deadly path. But more experienced meteorologists had overruled him. It's not clear if a last-minute warning would have made a difference. The storm swept away communication lines as it roared ashore.
I think within the Weather Bureau, there was the understanding that this was a very unique storm from the standpoint of its motion, where it went, and more importantly, how fast it got there.
The public blames the agency for the lack of warning. One critical letter prompts the senior forecaster in Washington to respond that they handled the situation, quote, fairly well under the circumstances. No one at the Weather Bureau lost his job after the storm. One thing that does change in the aftermath of the New England hurricane, the way in which the recovery is handled. Traditionally, private agencies like the Red Cross spearheaded relief efforts. But in the 1930s, President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs become the cornerstone of the relief efforts.
The Depression makes it impossible for private charity to keep up with the demand. So what we see happening in New England is the federal government stepping in and taking the place of either private charity or state or local government as a way of giving aid or trying to generate economic growth, which is what the New Deal is trying to do.
Tens of thousands of unemployed men found themselves back at work again because of the hurricane. There was another unexpected beneficiary of the hurricane, the airline industry.
People who've never flown before are getting on planes. The streets are choked with fallen trees, with debris. Same for railroad lines, which are absolutely torn up and destroyed. All of a sudden, there's a huge demand for flights.
Jeff Moore, who rode out the storm with his family, cheated death twice by surviving a heart attack and the hurricane. His luck runs out 18 months later when he dies from complications after surgery. He was just 42 years old.
He went out so fast that he could only say a few things, including the say goodbye to my sweetheart.
His sweetheart, Catherine, never remarries. The only meteorologist to predict the storm's probable landfall in New England was Charles Pierce. He spends nearly 4 decades with the Weather Service until his retirement in 1973. Joseph Matos, who lost 4 children at the causeway, stays in Jamestown, Rhode Island for the rest of his life.
He never would talk much about this. He would break down when he did talk about it, naturally. He never got over it, but he had to live his whole life with it.
Clayton Chellis, who was able to swim to safety during the storm, follows his love of the sea by joining the Navy right out of high school. After serving in the Pacific Theater during World War II, he drowns. He was 19 years old.
Ironically, the one person who survived this bus tragedy, because of his swimming ability, ends up drowning.
It's almost as if fate had written some kind of script, and it didn't get him the first time, but it did the second.
Most residents of Jamestown forgive bus driver Norm Caswell for his actions, believing he had the best interests of the children in mind. Some, however, like Bill Chellis, who was not on the bus, but lost his sister in the hurricane, can't help but still be angry.
Well, a stupid, dirty devil should have never tried to go across a one-lane causeway. Just, you couldn't even pass 2 cars. You know. I don't know what the man was thinking of. Of course, you know, hindsight's a great thing, but...
No one was harder on Caswell than himself.
He became not the amiable chap people had remembered before the hurricane, but a morose type of fellow. Didn't want to talk to people, and he just couldn't deal with it.
Plagued by depression, he dies 8 years after the storm, at the age of 54. In the end, Katharine Hepburn does not marry Howard Hughes. Nor does she get the part of Scarlett in Gone with the Wind. The Great Hurricane of 1938 does, however, mark a crossroads in her life.
Just as she rebuilt that house, just as she wanted it, she rebuilt her career, starting with the Philadelphia story. And after that, she really became the grande dame of American movies.
Her family home on the Connecticut shore remains Katharine Hepburn's refuge from the world for the rest of her life. She dies there in 2003 at the age of 96. Today, meteorologists agree that another hurricane on par with the 1938 storm will likely strike the northeastern United States someday. The question is whether it will result in an equally large loss of life. Radar, developed during World War II and refined over the years, now allows meteorologists to track a storm with pinpoint accuracy. What they still cannot do is predict its behavior, what path it will take, and whether it will die out or grow to monstrous proportions.
Intensity forecasting is probably the least efficient and the least known part of hurricane forecasting. So that meteorological nightmare is still out there, and if we're not careful to learn from what we've seen in the past, that kind of thing could be repeated along the United States coast in some shape or form.
If anything, more people in the American Northeast may be in danger from a hurricane than ever before. Waterfronts and beaches that were empty in 1938 are now crowded with development. More and more people live in harm's way.
And I think, wow, you know, what are you doing building houses? And it just, someday, something's going to happen. But there it is. People forget.
We feel it hasn't happened in 2 generations, it can't happen now. So we have an inexperienced population. Is our infrastructure different? Sure. Have we matured as a society? Sure. But are we any less susceptible to the devastation? Absolutely not.
Storms like this have a way of making all of the technology that people enjoy obsolete. And just when you think you have established the ideal world where you can do everything, a storm like this comes along and shows you how completely powerless you are in the face of nature.
September 22nd, 1938. A hurricane of unprecedented speed and ferocity has laid waste to more than 1,000 miles of shoreline, from Long Island to Maine.
It's like we got our health, and fortunately, we can rebuild the house.
The people of Jamestown, Rhode Island, face tragic news. Of the 8 children who were on board the town school bus the day before, 7 are dead. Only bus driver Norm Caswell and 11...
There was just rubble and just debris everywhere. I mean, not even a sense beyond that a house once stood there.
Always the actress, Hepburn poses for this photo in a bathtub.
Katharine Hepburn was very much on with the show. Fine, you know, we've lost the house, we've got our lives.
5,000 more. Only 5% of the population has insurance to cover the damage. The morning after the hurricane, Katharine Hepburn and her family returned to the ruins of their summer home in Fenwick, Connecticut.
The world turned upside down. Railroad tracks that are just sort of spiraling into nothingness. sailboats washed up on land, cars bobbing in water, neighborhoods that have just become splinters.
The storm destroyed 20,000 buildings and damaged 70